Good afternoon. During a week when the whole world is talking about Egypt in the context of Tahrir Square, we're going to be speaking about Egypt in the context of Egyptology. Our guest is Khristian Թութունջյան de Vardavane. I love saying that, I should say that again. Who is an Armenian from France, originally family from Egypt, and originally way back before that from Syunik. So if I get carried away and start talking about family history, it's because there aren't too many Armenians who can trace their roots that far back. And if I don't get carried away, then I promise to do that some other time with Khristian. Khristian, thank you for coming. Please tell me how Egyptology fares in Egypt, given this kind of political turmoil. Is it long-term good, long-term bad? Is there an effect?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. It is much more difficult for Egyptology to fare right now, of course, because of the turmoil in Egypt. I mean, it's not only a political change we're witnessing, we're also witnessing a political change in the policies of the Directorate of Antiquities in Egypt. Ah. Dr. Zaki Hawass is no more the director, as everybody knows. There is a new director. I have read this week his policies, and I think there is a slight shift. I'm not sure it is very positive. I'm waiting, like everybody, to see what this shift will be and what will be the shift in Egypt. I am personally very anxious. I do not know where Egypt is going. It's extremely difficult to forecast. I'm not sure of the intention of the Muslim Brothers, whether the appeal to the Christian community to be very calm is as sincere as they say. We will see. I hope it will be.
It's really interesting. Armenians from Egypt, Armenians from Syria, the natural reaction is to judge these political changes in the context of what has happened to us in the past. Mm. And the anxiety is certainly understandable to us. Is it understandable to them? Do they understand why we're concerned?
Many professionals, whether in the diplomatic circles or in Egyptology, understood that the day Mr. Mubarak announced that, or we understood that his son would take power, it was just a matter of time before something would happen in Egypt. The time was much shorter than anyone else expected. Mm. Now, you have also to understand that the very shocking sums which we are told the Mubarak family kept and their associates shocks us.
The size of the funds.
But the Egyptian, it also shocked the Egyptian, and since a long time accompanied by a lot of abuses of power. And we must understand and not judge too quickly the shift towards the Muslim Brotherhood as something extreme, just as a reaction over almost 3-decade rule of President Mubarak. It is very understandable to some point. Now, where will it go from then? That's a very, very key question. And what will Egypt be tomorrow?
You know, that's a question that in Armenia we listen to a little bit skeptically. Because we've now been living 20 years and are still waiting for that democracy to come. You know, so if anything, we have understood that it doesn't happen in a year.
No, it doesn't.
Still, your question is, even if it doesn't happen in a year, what direction are we going? That's your question. And how does that affect things like history, you know, the new nationalistic approach? I assume that's
absolutely
the concern.
Yes.
Under. And how could it go? If it went badly, how could it go? What does that mean for Egyptology, for a country whose history is part of everybody's history?
I can answer very directly to you. Many fanatics in the Muslim religion said that the first thing they would do if they went to power was to reduce the pharaohs in powder and the Cairo Museum objects in powder, and they would destroy antiquities, of course. Now,
why?
Because it represents something which is alien to them, which foreigners like, the values of which are different, and which those fanatics resent as a threat to their way of understanding Islam. Having said that, the mullah of Al-Azhar made an announcement a few days ago saying there was no contradiction between Islam and the existence on Egyptian soil of antiquities. And that if the horsemen of Muhammad had wanted to destroy everything, they would have done it a long time ago. And this has been a recurring discourse the past few days. Of course, enlightened Egyptians, of whether Muslims or Christian, understand that Egyptian heritage is not only of national value, but also of world value. We mustn't, a lot of people understand this very well. It's not only a question of economics. So many people in Egypt are very educated. They understand fully well the implication of what's going on. But there is always a fringe of people who never understand very clearly what should be done in many circumstances. Again, the extremism.
You're not in Egypt any longer. You live in Armenia. You've lived here 5 years.
5 years, yes.
And you have established Egyptology in Armenia. What does that mean? There has not been Egyptology in Armenia?
No, as I was telling you before, Boris Piotrovsky, who is very well known for having Russian studies, who originally wanted to be an Egyptologist. A very little number of people know that. Then he became director of the Hermitage and said to my colleague Manana Hevelidze in Tbilisi, who is also an Egyptologist there, and who was a student of Piotrovsky, that it was easier to find elephants in the Soviet Union than Egyptologists. Now why? Prior to the First World War, Russian Egyptology was very strong. There used to be an Egyptologist, among others, called Golenichev, who was extremely proficient in Egyptology, but with the revolution had to flee to Europe. His library is now in Paris, and it is one of the French Egyptology libraries. After the First World War, Russian Egyptology died, and it was only revived 10 years ago by Dr. Belova and her team. And since then, they've made some very good job in Memphis area. Now, in between, there was nothing, and that includes Armenia. Armenia was part of the Soviet Union. Now, what I came here to do was to create a discipline which for me is a life vocation. I'm an Egyptologist since prior to 5. I say 5 years old, but in fact I wrote my first hieroglyphic prior to 5 years old.
Hieroglyphics.
Yeah. And ever since I've been an Egyptologist.
And so what does Egyptology in Armenia mean? What does it do? How is it supported? Are there students?
It was created thanks to a very bold decision of Professor Aram Simonyan, the rector of the university, in a country where there was no previous tradition, as he actually explained to an Egyptian delegation which came recently. And it was a very courageous, very bold, very original decision to take. It was supported by academicians and a number of researchers whom I cannot mention because this would be too long. And of course, it had to be validated by the High Scientific Council of the university 6 months later. There was a unanimous vote that day. I mean, an opportunity was given by Mr. Simonyan for anyone to contest this decision. But in fact, I think there were 70 members or so, and the vote was unanimous. Now, what does it imply? It implies creating a discipline from zero. We had to find the place. We had to create a library, which is very difficult. In fact, this is where we benefited from the fact that many Egyptology publications are PDF'd across the planet since 10 years. So that was tremendous help.
Egyptology is not just archaeology.
No, of course not. No. I mean, this is precisely why our center depends directly to the rector and not any faculty. Yeah. We are cross and multidisciplinary. What we do concerns chemistry and the history of technology. It concerns botany, it concerns the language, it concerns a number of art conservation studies, museum studies. No, we wanted to create a new type of center, which was totally multidisciplinary. And I must say that a few discoveries later, we're very happy we did, actually. This freedom gave us a very big incentive. Remember that we're starting from scratch. French and British and Germans and American have over a century of Egyptology behind them with all the means and the state funding. In France, it's in millions of euros. In other countries, not far from this. We started on state budget. This is a question that some in fact, I had the
state has allocated budget to the university to allocate to
from the very beginning.
To teach.
A bold decision, a courageous one. Professor Fransen is the director of the Carsten Niebuhr Institute in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and he came to visit us a few days ago. And he had a remark: we all believe that this is diaspora money, and I said, not a single penny. Everything was built with the Republic's means from scratch. Our salaries are very low, too low, like unfortunately for all employees of the university. There's something to be done there, clearly. But whatever we did with our means. And
is there a market for Egyptologists? Should I become an Egyptologist? World over,
it's a very good question. I had 10 students 2 years ago. I reduced them to 1. Another born Egyptologist who arrived in my department trembling, and I said, okay, I understand what you feel, come over. We cannot afford in Armenia to have too many Egyptologists. I always wait for another born Egyptologist to appear, in which case we will make some room. But the point is, aside from what Armenia can obtain from the study from Egyptology as relations between Egypt and Armenia, a nation is great not for what it has, but what it gives to the world. And from that point of view, the university has understood that it has a department which does fundamental research which concerns the entire planet. And this is what we do.
Let's conclude with what you've done. You and Tutankhamun, what do you have in common?
Yes, it's another good question. When I was 23, I discovered part of the material of Tutankhamun's treasure in London. It went around the world, made the press. This work was a Knowledge in Egyptology Today, a book published by Cambridge University in 2008, 20 years later, as the type work of the new scientific Egyptology. It's in chapter 1, page 15, and I'm very proud of that. This is my greatest pride. It took 20 years of reflection, but this is the price to pay in the academic world. I went into Egyptology thinking that Egyptology needed more scientific background. At the time, I was sometimes even considered as a half Egyptologist because Egyptology was, at the time, more art, language, history. 20 years later, in this book called Egyptology Today, I mentioned to you, science has taken its place in Egyptology through various ways: archaeobotany, archaeomythology, archaeozoology, resistivity, all sorts of very hard science-type disciplines which provide new information for our study of ancient Egypt. Yes, after all these years, my work has been recognized, but it takes time. And what we're doing now will take time to be recognized too.
Which is the message for academics everywhere, especially in a country like this where economic considerations often take first place. So
it does. And yeah, that's one message. The other message is there were very bizarre theories when I arrived here about the fact that, for example, the Hyksos were of Armenian origin, which is completely untrue. One has no, absolutely not. I'm very sorry to tell you that. Hyksos in ancient Egyptian means Heka, is to be translated Heka Hasut, which means ruler of the foreign lands. And since a few months, we've not only localized it in Palestine since a long time, but we know exactly in the Gaza area where those kings had their seats and everything. One must be very rigorous. And in the way, I've also heard, for example, that Nefertiti had some Armenian origin and then checked it and not the slightest.
And Cleopatra?
No. Well, Cleopatra killed the king of Armenia and his family, so I think there's a contradiction there. No, one has to be rigorous because the outside world is watching. And what we did in 5 years is to install an international reputation. We have, for example, a newsletter which is now read by 1,700 scholars in 51 countries. And that for us is a very big advance because starting from zero to the point that where foreign scholars come to see us and make donations of books is a big, big, big step. And I thought it would take at least 5 years, and it took 5 years, which is good news as far as we're concerned.
Thank you. We're talking about thousands of years in just a few minutes. We appreciate your work. We appreciate your coming. And the messages are clear that academia still has a place in any society and in the world economy. Our guest is Քրիստիան Թութունջյան de Վարդավանը, head of the Egyptology department of Yerevan State University, and talking about the value of Egyptology, history, archaeology, linguistics, all at a time when Egypt itself is going through major changes and asking major questions about its past and its future. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.